Hello students, welcome back to your economics class. Let us do a short recap of what we studied in our last class, that is yesterday, and continue with today's class. Yesterday we discussed a very important topic, that is how to do a comparison among the three sectors of the economy. So to do so, we take into account two things. First is the total production happening in that particular sector, and secondly the number of people working in that sector. So any kind of comparison to happen, we have to take into consideration both of these factors. Now when we count the total production, or when we calculate the total production in each sector, we have to take into account the monetary value of the goods and services and not the actual number of goods. Now monetary value means what is the rupee amount that is associated with that particular goods or service. Now when we do this calculation of counting the total number of goods and services in a particular sector, we take into account the final goods and services. Final goods and services are the refined goods, and that is what we take into account when we calculate the GDP. Now while doing this calculation, we do not take into account the intermediate goods and services, which are the unfinished products where there is a scope for further reform. So these products are not included while calculating the GDP. Now why so? Because we want to avoid the error or the defect of multiple counting, which is also known as the double counting. We try to avoid this particular error where we end up calculating more the same item twice or thrice or more than that. So we avoid counting any of the intermediate goods involved in the manufacturing or production of any particular goods. So the final goods and services includes the value of all the intermediate goods and services, and finally it is this final goods and services we calculate and we sum up for each sector of the economy, and we calculate the GDP. Now GDP indicates how big, how strong, how powerful your economy is. It is the best indicator, and the concept of GDP is common across countries. It is not only India which calculates the GDP, it is all the countries which is doing so. Every country has the sectors of economy. It does not understand the geographical boundaries. These are concepts which are common to all the countries. Now let's understand the concept of GDP better. Now to calculate GDP, we first add up the value of the final goods and services in the primary sector. Then we add up the value of the final goods and services in the secondary. And finally, we add up the value of the final goods and services in the tertiary sector. When we add the values of the final goods and services in all the three sectors, we get the sum of the production in the three sectors, which is known commonly as the GDP. That is gross domestic product, means the total production happening in the country. Now the best definition of gross domestic product is that it is the value of the final goods and services produced within a country, that is domestic, so within a country during a particular year. So GDP is always calculated in a yearly basis. You cannot calculate it for 10 years saying that GDP is 5%. No, GDP is always calculated in a yearly basis. So that is what we discussed in this particular topic. Now let's move on to the next topic. So today we are going to discuss the historical changes in the sector. Now this is a very easy peasy topic, but I'm going to rush you through to explain how the economy has seen the changes in the various sectors. Now the economy is made up of three sectors: primary, secondary and tertiary. In the historical changes, we are going to go to the back, understand how these sectors have evolved over the past years, 100 years maybe. So we are not going to study it in the context of India. We are going to study the historical changes in the sectors across various developed countries. We are going to see how these three sectors have changed form, changed the way they are functioning across various countries, across time, and understand how this transformation of changes in the various sectors have happened. So that is what is the topic for today. So basically the objective for today's class is to understand the evolution, the blooming or the development of the various sectors of the economy, how they have changed from one form to the other in a span of maybe 100 years, and we are going to study this in terms of a developed country. Now you would be asking me, why are we going to study this in terms of a developed country? Why not an underdeveloped or a developing country? Now developed country, because in a developed country all these three sectors of the economy are very prominent, very active. So to understand the changes which these sectors have undergone, we have to study in terms of a developed country where all these three economies are active, fully functioning. So we are taking into consideration only the historical changes in the sectors in a developed country. So this is a general pattern of evolution of these sectors in all developed countries that we are going to discuss in this particular topic. Now, when we compare countries or we compare the various sectors, we take into account two important things. The first is total production of goods and services, which is basically the GDP, and secondly the number of people engaged in that sector, that is employment. How many people are working in that sector? What is the manpower strength in that particular sector? So now in this topic we are going to see how this transformation or transition from primary to secondary and then finally to tertiary sector has happened over a period of maybe 100 years in all the developed countries. So we will study the shift in the economy which is seen in most developed countries. Now let's understand how this shift has happened from primary to secondary and secondary to tertiary. Now when I'm talking about shift in the economy, it means the shift in the importance of that sector. We are going to study how the importance of primary sector has shifted to secondary and then finally to tertiary. So basically shift of the importance of that sector, shift of the sector's contribution to the GDP is what we are going to understand in this topic. So we will go back in history and understand over the period of years how the importance of primary has changed, and finally the secondary sector has emerged, and finally now we have a tertiary sector which is the most prominent and the most powerful sector in terms of total production along with the number of people engaged in it. Now when we go back in time, in all the countries across the world, agriculture was the most important economic activity. People were mostly involved in any kind of activities which are related directly or indirectly to agriculture, fishing, all the activities which are in the primary sector. That is why the primary sector is called the agriculture related sector. Now in the initial times all kinds of development happened only in this sector. This was the most prominent, the most powerful sector in the initial days back in history, and all the developed countries depended on the primary sector. Now with time what happened is technology evolved. Lot of new technologies started. Agriculture saw a huge shift. Why? Because we started using technology in agriculture. We started using canals, we started using threshers, we started using various irrigation methods, harvesting, all sorts of new things came up in agriculture. In other words, we can say that we started depending on modern technology, modern ways of farming. We started utilizing all sorts of technology to improve our agricultural production. So when we started using technology in the primary sector, like in India, we started using during the Green Revolution, when we started using the hybrid seeds, we started using all modern farming machineries, electricity, dams. So all these are basically technology. We started using it in the primary sector. Why we used it? To make sure that the food production increases. So when we used all this, what happened? The primary sector evolved. It became bigger. More people were engaged in it. More people were employed in the agricultural sector. So obviously the contribution of the primary sector to the GDP, that is the total production of the country, will increase. Now let's understand this even better. Now agricultural sector flourished when we use technology. Of course it will, because the moment we use technology, we started using more and more land. Large farmers increased. We started increasing, more areas were covered in agriculture. When we did more farming, more agriculture, what happened? We started producing more and more goods. More and more natural goods were produced, because primary sector produces only natural products. So once these natural products were produced, what happens? Excessive of these products happened, and finally people started also engaging themselves in various activities related to agriculture. Not just as farmers, they started working as a trader or any business which is a non-farming activities, like a shopkeeping which sells agricultural products, a trader or a shopkeeper or anything, or a dairy farm. All these are non-farming activities, but people started depending on these activities. Why? Because of excessive production in this sector due to the use of technology. So more and more of buying and selling happened in this sector. When that happened, the contribution of the primary sector to the economy, to the GDP increased. So when we remember the calculation, value of the final goods and services in the primary sector plus the value in the secondary, plus the value of the final goods and services in the tertiary sector, when you total up, you get the GDP, right? So the contribution of the values of the final goods and services in the primary sector increased. So it was the most dominant sector, the most prominent and dominant sector. But when this primary sector peaked, it reached the height, to the best possible level. Around that time, activities in the secondary sector also increased. Now, why this increase happened? It happened because too much of things were produced in the primary sector. Excessive amounts of things were produced. Now, these excessive amounts of things had to be utilized in some better way. Suppose I am an apple farmer, okay? I cultivate apples. Like, without using technology, I was cultivating, suppose, 50 kgs of apple per year. Now, with technology, I have started producing 1000 kgs, which has increased many-fold. Now, with all these apples, I cannot only just sell it directly in the market. I need to use apples and sell it in different forms. So, what will I do? I will try to sell it to a factory who will produce jam using my apples, will try to make some juice using the apples that I am selling. So, because of this so much of production happening in the primary sector, all the natural products were finally shifted to the secondary sector. More and more industries and factories were established. Industries were there earlier also. It's not like primary sector was the only sector in the economy. Secondary sector was of course there, but it was smaller in size. If the size of the primary sector was this much, secondary sector was this much. Now with more and more production in the primary sector, the secondary sector increased in size, and it increased so much that the size of the primary sector became lesser and the size of the secondary sector became larger. And because the secondary sector became larger in size, more factories were set up, more people were required in this sector. So manpower, people who were working in farms started working in factories. Because technology was used in primary sector, so most of the work was done by machines. So when work was done by machines, people were left with no work, and so they had to go to industries and factories to get work. So employment shift happened from primary to secondary sector, and people like you and me, we started buying more of goods which are produced in factories. Rather than buying normal apples, we would go for buying Tropicana juice, right? Apple juice. So this shift happened, and this is how the shift happened in a developed country. Now, the importance of the secondary sector increased during this time, okay, when more and more factories were set up. And when it increased, the total production of goods produced in the secondary sector also increased, employment increased. So finally the shift from the primary sector to the secondary sector happened, and the contribution of the secondary sector to the GDP increased. The secondary sector contributed more compared to the primary sector to the GDP now, because more and more people are engaged in it and more production happened in it. Now, with all this happening, there started the need of another sector which would help increase the efficiency of the primary and the secondary sector. That is when the tertiary sector came into play. The tertiary sector is nothing but the service sector, because it generates all kinds of services. It aids and supports the primary and the secondary sector. Now, when the primary sector and the secondary sector reaches its peak, we need support. These two sectors cannot function alone, right? Because all the three sectors of the economy are dependent on each other. Now, when the primary became top, then the secondary came up, right? And then it also reached the top, and finally these two sectors would need some help and support, and which is provided by the tertiary or the service sector. How? Because they were the ones providing transport, tourism, trade, all these services, including call centers, banks, education, healthcare. All these are subsidiary services which help in the production process. It does not produce anything, but it helps or aids in the process of production in the primary and secondary sectors. In other words, it increased the efficiency of the two sectors. So more and more with time, the primary and the secondary sector became dependent on the tertiary sector in such a way that now is a time when the tertiary sector is far more advanced compared to the other two sectors. The primary and the secondary sector now cannot function even for a day without the tertiary sector. People like you and me, we don't work in the primary and secondary sector. When we study, when we are educated, when we go to schools, we have in mind that we'll work in somewhere in the tertiary sector. That is the largest sector right now. Why? Because none of the things in the primary and secondary can happen without the tertiary sector's help. So the tertiary sector now contributes the largest amount to the GDP. Okay, and the growth that the tertiary sector has seen is unprecedented. It was unexpected. Nobody had dreamt or imagined that such kind of progress and growth would happen in the tertiary sector. So the shift from secondary to tertiary sector happened when the primary and the secondary became completely dependent on the tertiary sector for any kind of services. So it became the most important sector in terms of total production of services along with the employment generation. And that is why right now in all developed countries, service sector is the strongest sector. The contribution to the GDP, that is the value of goods and services produced in this particular sector, that is tertiary sector, is the highest. It is so high that primary and secondary can't even get into competition. Now, let's do a recap of what we have studied so far. What we have studied is basically the general pattern that we see in all developed countries in terms of shift of the economy. When I say the shift of economy, it means shift from primary to secondary and finally to tertiary. So that is the historical change in sectors. So initially, as a method of farming changed, agricultural sector flourished. It started to flourish and become better and better because of the use of technology. So new manufacturing methods also were introduced, and finally factories came up because of excessive production happening in the primary sector. Somewhere these excessive products, natural products, had to be used, so the factories and the industries grew manifold. And finally the final shift happened of total production and employment to the tertiary sector in all developed countries, because the primary and the secondary sector was completely dependent on the tertiary sector. So this is what this particular topic is about. Generally the questions which come from this topic is write a short note on the historical change in sectors. I'm going to share this note with you all. Kindly copy it in your copies. And for this video and this particular lecture, I'm not asking you to do any homework because we have a chapter test on Friday, and I've already given you 2 homeworks in my last class. So happy learning. If you have any doubts, please feel free to call me. Thank you.